Good morning, everyone. And I'm going to start, as always, by going around and just checking in with people, seeing how their classes are going, how their mentorships are going, ideally, if they're just starting or if they are maybe in their midst. So I'll start with Habasachi. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and my classes are going well. And mentorship has just got started, and I participated in observing one lecture of Rania, which she gave a couple of weeks ago. And that's about it. We just got started.
Ronia, how about you?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rania Kassoum from the University of Arkansas. And it's our spring break now, so
Thank you for being here.
no problem. It's not a real break for us. It's more like catch up on your work break. So I've been doing a lot of reading and research while my teaching is a little quiet right now. So
very cool. Karen, how about you?
Good morning, everyone. I'm at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. I'm not currently working with a mentee, but I feel like I've been doing a lot of drumming up sales for Palm. For sure. So I have a couple of informal mentees who are on the job market, and pretty much every paper that we read together this spring, I've forwarded to them and be like, you need to know about this before you go to your interview. Like, I need to talk about this. And two of them have kind of gone out there and they came back and said, if I hadn't had that conversation with you, I really would have screwed up. Like my conversation with usually administrators, which I find that kind of interesting, but it's good to be with you all, especially this paper.
That's good feedback to hear. Thank you for that. Nancy, how about you?
Hi all, I'm from Iowa State University and first-time mentor.
Welcome.
We just got started. Josephine has visited my class and then realized she still needs to send her recording in. So said she doesn't want to visit my class anymore until she's sent her recording in. So I'm like, okay, well then I'll expect her in class possibly, not Friday because we have a conflict, maybe Monday. But so it's this digital class thing makes class visiting a little easier. So that's sure. Nice. And I'm super excited to be here. My classes are doing fine. I'm a little jealous. Spring break, what is this thing of which you speak? Our university didn't want anybody going anywhere. So we did not have fall break. We do not have spring break. What is this thing? So.
And now I realize, like, oh, that's why we do spring break, to keep us from killing each other by going straight through it.
It's a mental health exercise.
Absolutely.
Yes. Oh, and I taught summer class too, so I'm just a little.
You're literally going to go a full 12 months, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit more because I taught the summer. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So you'll need a break. Christina, good morning. What's up with you? Oops, she may be. Christina? We'll come back. Holly, how are you doing?
I'm good. I don't even want to say it, but I'm on sabbatical. But my school did too.
I am too.
My school did the same thing where we skipped every single break, not even a one-day break, but they're almost done, which is crazy. The second week in April, they'll be out.
Oh my goodness. Wow. When did you get back?
Late January.
So it's just
really when you take out all of those breaks. Yeah,
just condense everything. Wow.
Mm-hmm. I'm at Rocky Mountain College in Montana. My mentee is doing well. We've done all our observations and things, and she's running her active learning activity right now and getting good feedback on it from the students. And we implemented some good assessment items, I think. So I think she'll get some good data on that. And her talk just got accepted at HAPS. So she'll be presenting that there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, Sue, what's going on in your neck of the woods?
Hi. Well, at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, it's a nice sunny day. We do have a spring break next week. I'm not teaching right now, but I'm keeping plenty busy on task forces and committees and Palm. And Karen, I may have a new mentee for you. There's someone who just corresponded with me this past week who sounds like might be a good fit with you. So stay tuned.
Okay,
Very
thanks.
cool. And Christina, you want to give it another shot?
Sure.
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect. Yeah. My computer just will not let me be on Outlook and Zoom. Those two programs don't get anyway. So this is my, I guess, first full month as part of this Palm program.
Cool.
So I'm at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'm an ARACTA postdoc
Nice.
and mentored by Becca Price at University of Washington Bothell. We met through the Saber Buddies program, so this is a cool, like, full loop of the Deber world. And so I'm designing a.
Uh-oh.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you
Sorry.
try to check your email there? Is that
I
what
didn't. I got an email. It's bad.
that?
I'll have to charge my iPad and just have Zoom for just iPad.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there.
But don't worry about it. I'm excited to see us making inroads into the ARACTA community. It's really exciting that we're reaching into have people who are going to be future full-time faculty taking a serious interest in active learning at this more formative stage, which is really, so it's very exciting. Welcome. And Carlos joins us. Carlos, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
And I need to ask before you go any further, how many of those backgrounds do you have? I think that's the third different version I've seen.
We switch it up partly to hide the ballerina hippo that is next to me.
That's cute.
I'm guilty because I entertained Dr. Sjogren for an extra 10 minutes earlier, and that's why we're late.
Oh, so you guys are doing a visit right now?
No, she's in biotech at NC State.
Oh, you literally are just simply neighbors. That's awesome. So why don't we just segue over to Carly? How's Carlos? How are you?
Hello, yeah, I am doing well. So I am an education postdoc in the biotechnology program. And so Carlos is my work mentor, but I have a POM mentor who is another mentor. I have many mentors and it's wonderful.
Just before you came on, I was saying it's very exciting to see us reaching into the more trainee level and get people really getting this in right on the ground floor. So very happy to have you.
I am so happy to be here. I share regularly that I met Sue in 2018 and was in a research postdoc where it didn't make sense to join. And so it's been 3 years of waiting to become a member and be part of this. So I'm always excited to be here.
Wonderful. This is a healthy crowd. Thank you guys all for being here. This is a brand new essay published March of 21. When I was looking around for what we would talk about for this latest edition, I was struck by this. I love papers like this. Carlos had given us one a couple months ago that just took a very simple question and made us sort of think about it on a larger level, things that question our assumptions. And this is another one of those, the notion of student success. How do we define student success? And what is an appropriate definition for student success? And I think a lot of this comes down to the way that we have really, in a very healthy way, started reconsidering how our classes are being done with equity and inclusion in mind. In the abstract, this sentence draws to me. The majority of articles, because this is a meta-analysis, the majority of articles did not explicitly define success, inherently suggesting, quote unquote, everyone knows its definition. Sort of like you're in some kind of a club, and if you're not in the club, you don't necessarily, or you got to figure it out for yourself, what it means to define success. And so I appreciate the thought-provoking nature of this essay. By being an essay, it's less of a research-driven thing, but it makes you think, and it certainly made me think about what I do in my classes and how I try to convey to my students that they are doing something that I would deem successful. And you see here in a model, and I should emphasize right at the start here, the paper is considering student success from the perspective of research, right? How do researchers define success, and how do we use that for metrics? I think a lot of our conversations, this is the third time I've talked about this paper with a third different group. I think we've thought about success a lot from the standpoint of how we would define success as teachers for our own students. So there's a lot in parallel there, how a researcher would define success and how a teacher would define success, but there's not necessarily perfect overlap. And so as we think about what they talk about in here, just bear those two different masters in mind, the DBER researcher and the instructor who's simply trying to get the most out of their particular classroom and the composition of students that they have. I mention all this because what you see here is the definition of success in terms of the research process. And the research process could absolutely end up informing the teaching process, but just to maybe split some hairs about, or maybe even further complicate the idea of how we're ultimately going to think about success when we go through and look at this. So let me actually start. I told you right up front that I was challenged by this, sort of thinking about what I've done in the past and has it been appropriate? And what's the difference in terms of level of class, composition of class, background of students, things like that? Traditionally, what have you guys been doing in terms of defining success? And are there things in this article that made you sort of think a little bit about how you yourselves define success?
We just finished the 5-year review of our biology program. And one of the things that we were looking at was like, are we doing a good job? And really, we used a formative and summative exam on content. So we fell squarely within the academic success. And then listed graduates that we knew about and the careers that they went on to have. But that kind of assumed that it was, I don't know, right or correct that they went into a science field. And the more prestigious, the more likely we were to list them.
Sure.
But we don't have any real mechanism to track anything once they're gone. And that's a real problem. So like, we couldn't track any of the things they're talking about here, like actual persistence in STEM or resilience or anything. Just because we lose them as soon as they stop checking their academic email. And we only know because they ask for letters of recommendations and things that they go on to these other programs. So that's kind of the snag point. I would be interested to know what they're up to. But we don't have that mechanism in place as a school.
I think we have a similar story that we've gotten better at trying to track our alums. For a small liberal arts private school that relies heavily on alumni donations, I've always been surprised by how lackadaisical we seem to treat like tracking our alums. That seems really self-defeating to me. And we've gotten better at it over the years, but I think we have fallen under some of those traditional definitions as you described, like who has the sexiest career, right, that we can highlight, and are we in a certain percentile on a field exam or something like that. And so those become our perceptions of success, and maybe they become our perceptions of success because they're the most easily accessible perceptions. And so I think what we've had to ask ourselves, and we have not had agreement in our department on this, right? We have some traditional content first folks. We have some people that are much more experiential in their focus, and everyone falls on the spectrum somewhere. But we certainly haven't had a departmental agreement on like, okay, this is what we should be using. This is our metric to figure it out. Perhaps a holistic approach looking at multiple tools, right? Like you don't have to pick one or the other. Could we do a little of both to try to get a more complete picture?
We can't even agree on the content that.
Yeah, well, there's that. There is that too.
And I teach at a medical school, and there we define success a little differently, because all the students, well, most of the students who are there were already overachievers. They're already, they are going to, even for 0.02% points, they are going to like fight over that. And very recently, what we have done from last year, the entire curriculum has shifted to a pass-fail. Yeah, so we don't have A, B, C, no grades. Either you pass or you fail. And we are more moving towards the competency-based education. So you need to have this particular competency, and then you move to the program. And one way, and during the medical career, they have to pass some exam to get into residency. And one is the USMLE, which are 3 steps, USMLE 1, 2, and 3. And now USMLE step 1 from next year, that is also going to get into pass and fail. Previously, what used to happen by looking at the scores of USMLE, the residency directors could determine whether there's a good student or not, because now that is going to be pass fail, and we also having a pass fail, so it's getting more. Now the success for students as far as the residency, they determine by like anything outside med school. Have they done research? Have they published? So if you have published something in while you're in med school, it means that is like that is there. That can be one definition. And we had, in fact, our residency match last weekend, and I'm glad to say all of them, they matched in really good residencies all over the country. So that's one measure of success we would look at.
So is it safe to say then that they're taking a more holistic approach, that they are, this is a national decision, just so I have this right, that the step
Exactly,
one,
yeah.
That's fast. I didn't know that. So the step 1 is pass fail. And then when you go to apply for a residency, they can't just look for a set of numbers then. They've got to
but till now they still have 2 more steps, step 2 and step 3. Step 2 is clinical, but those are not pass fail yet.
Okay.
But now it is, and as a result, me personally, I think, well, it is a great step forward, like having pass fail, it is less stress on the students. So you don't have to fight for every point, but it becomes more difficult for the residency director to determine who is a better fit. But they're working through it. So,
well, I've learned something today. Thank you.
I think that's amazing that they're doing that at the medical school level, because I've noticed, and I'm always contemplating these things. I noticed that my kids, I have 4 kiddos, and these days, they eat in elementary school, y'all, they don't give them ABC like I had when I was a kid, right? So they have a list of learning objectives. And did you meet that on a 1, 2, 3, or are you proficient? Do you need development and whatnot? And so I wonder, in my dream world, I think we should have that in college. I have a whole problem with grades in general. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say that a student in my class gets a 79.9, or let's say a 79, and I round up to a B, right? Is that really the same as someone who got an 89%? That's 10 percentage difference between both that got a low B that was rounded up to a high B. So what does that really say when we look at grades about our student performance? Are they all capable of doing the same thing? I would love to see assessment as, here's a list of learning objectives. Did my student know how to convert from milligrams to grams? And I say 1, 2, 3, either pass or fail. So I really love this idea, so we can kind of move away from it. I just don't know how feasible it would be to do this. How do you start such change, you know?
Well, it starts with a lot of discussions like you are talking about it, and then we had lots of committee meetings, and finally, we also got the students involved. Like this paper talks about getting the students' perspective. When students define success, they're focused on different aspects such as gaining leadership skills and building career networks. So we get the students involved. So in our curriculum committee meeting, there's always like 2 students present. So their thoughts about anything which is going on is important, because they can think from outside the box, so to say, because they are the ones who are learning, right? So we think that they should be doing it in one particular manner, which probably is not right all the time.
I'd like to pick up on something Carlos just put in the chat and tie it in with what we've been talking about, this idea that it's the majority culture and thought that determines what the standards are for everybody. And the paper did suggest getting student input and doing things like, focus groups and interviews. And absolutely, those are wonderful, especially if you make sure that you include students from minoritized or underrepresented or normally unheard groups. They do point out how extremely time intensive that is. And there are a couple of us here who are working on a paper for Palm and realizing that quantitative data really doesn't tell the story or much of a story, that it's getting the personal stories behind that quantitative data that really makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
I think
So,
this is interesting. So like in terms of the 2 lists, I think table 1 and table 2 of like the types of metrics that are used. There's also, and I don't know if this is just like the time gap between when I was an undergrad and now, or is like representative of when the transition happened, or if it's a more of a growth and mental transition for me as I've been more aware. But in undergrad, it felt very much like the only success was at first academic success, and then when you're graduating, are you able to do you have a plan next? That was the only success, especially the only success recognized by the faculty. And now I think we've been seeing that there is a whole lot more ways to judge success, but even then, these still seem a lot more focused on like how would you be judged success versus like what the students feeling successful. Like it still seems to miss a little bit of the what were the students' goals going in? Were they successful to meeting their own ideas?
When I first started engaging in all of these conversations and learning about active learning, I never really understood the phrase student-centered. Like it seemed to me like, well, of course it's student-centered because it's a student classroom. And when you make observations like that, it reminds me that the idea of something being student-centered is not as self-evident that I assumed it would be. Because what I think you're asking for there, or at least advocating for, is the idea of success definitions that are in fact student-centered, not thinking about it in terms of I really liked Holly's example, right? Here's my 5-year department review. Is the department doing its job? Are the students, in fact, feeling that they're getting something? Is there success that can be measured at the level of what the students are getting in terms of their achievement, in terms of attaining objectives, things like that? And that was enlightening for me. I'm like, oh yeah, you really do have to work for this whole student-centered thing.
Well, it's one of those confounding variables behind a lot of these, like students will not persist unless they're meeting their own goals.
Yeah.
And so it affects all of these, but I don't think it was particularly acknowledged in this paper.
Right.
Just to dovetail onto that, one thing that I thought the paper did a really good job of is talking about the different demographics and different student populations in general. And if we're looking at student-centered definitions of student success, I think a lot of time and effort needs to be put into supporting students in how they're thinking about their goals, particularly as freshmen, and particularly with the first generation student population, because there's a lot of times if you tell or ask somebody, what do you want to do, or what are your goals? If you don't know what you don't know, that goal is going to be a lot less than it could be. And I think that's something just from a student success perspective or student affairs perspective, we need to be really careful with, supporting students that, particularly in academia, it's a completely different culture. It's a completely different thing. And we're asking them to navigate stuff that they don't even know what they don't know. Because I'm a former first generation student. And even today as a faculty member, I'm like, I didn't even know that was a thing. And, so that's something that I think this paper brings out to some extent. And I really appreciate your picking this paper, by the way.
Yeah.
See, you bring up a really great point, and Christina made me think. Just asking students what are their course goals or what do they want to get out of that, and they may not know at the beginning, but if you remind them, and that's the part where I forget, if you remind them sometime in the middle, how have your goals changed now that you know something about this topic or about this field, and then at the end, did you accomplish your goals, and if not, that's okay. What will you do to reach those? And I've been doing that for a couple of semesters, and I'm sold. I wish that would have more weight than grades, and I don't know how to.
We've had the enactment of a formal experiential learning requirement here for our students to graduate, and it's it had to be explained to me how lab stuff wasn't inherently experiential, and the difference was exactly what you just said, at least by the definitions we've been using. The idea of thinking about goals and reflecting on where you've come from, what you've learned, that added component to it. So as you're describing that, it made me think about, oh yeah, that's all that experiential stuff we've been talking about here.
One thing that I think ties in really well with this is the idea of values affirmation for all students, but especially underrepresented students, first generation students who may have cultural expectations and personal expectations that go way beyond a high GPA or graduating with honors in their field. So I'm really sold on using those to dovetail. And that's different from knowing career options. That's just recognizing that you have a foundation inside yourself of something that's important and keeping that in mind moving through an academic program. So I'm going to say goodbye. I have to go talk to Jeff Shinsky, who was our seminar speaker yesterday.
Oh, that's probably important. All right, well, thanks for joining us.
See you guys.
So as you look here on these tables, it being a meta-analysis, the way this was generated was to look for those papers that are very explicit in their measure of student success, and then looking at the outcome variables in terms of how this has been done in all 52 of the papers that they chose to look at. So in the articles that we have an explicit definition, 17 out of the 21 make a big deal about academic standards, grades, GPAs, exam scores, etc. And so you have here representative quotations on the right. They're cherry picked out, so you don't know what the context is. I'm actually very intrigued if you go down to the social one, collective success underpinned the Akina Kaupapa goal. So I assume that's a Maori word, but just that one standalone sentence by itself is intriguing to me. Like, okay, I think I'd like to know what that was all about. The point of this table, though, is the emphasis on traditional measures, academic measures. And that's not to say that academic measures don't have a place here. Ideally, we do want some kind of benchmark, right, by which we can use. And so it doesn't mean we get rid of them per se, but maybe pair them or accompany them with some of these other potential values. And one of the things I know I've thought a lot about is the second category of persistence, which takes you down here to table 2, when you look at sort of overall goals. And they put persistence at the top, but what they do here is they subdivide persistence into a whole bunch of different subcategories. And if you look beneath it, if you actually put together exam scores, course grades, GPA, that's still the highest measure that's being used. But you get a sense of persistence and retention being utilized as a maybe more fundamental way of considering student success than the top figure belies. I think this is going to vary a lot depending on if you're looking at an introductory level course or a senior level course. It absolutely could vary depending on the institutional type you're in, and certainly whatever goals you yourself set. And one of the things I was struck by in reading this was thinking about the way you assess your class. What are you grading? What percent is each thing counting towards a grade? And how does that reflect what you think student success is? Karen, go ahead.
As I read through this entire article, one of the other facets that's related to all of this is how we support our students with letters of recommendation. And just looking at this table and seeing all of the things out there that I can choose from for any given student is so liberating. I think all of us probably have this experience when we're writing letters for our students, that we know we need to convey the rigor of our course and the significance of a particular grade earned. But I am always dashed when I have a student who, has that thing that is kind of hard to define by, the conventional or assumed, understood common meaning of success. And for me, that's another place where, right, we can open things up and assert more individual narratives about students' trajectories, right, and what challenges they've overcome. And in this table in particular, just seeing them kind of mapped out, that really just opens options for me. Like, I think I was doing that at some letters, but this is an opportunity as well to communicate with graduate schools and things like that. That's it's bubbling up from beneath, so to speak.
Thank you for that. So, go ahead.
I guess what we've seen for a long time is there are things like letters of recommendation, and we do submit CVs whenever we're applying for whatever the next step is and all of this. But what we've seen time and time again is that, especially now that you have thousands of applicants for any slot in almost anything, that it's just the easiest to use any sort of quantitative metric to pre-screen before those important things and the real meat worth considering are even considered at all. And so my fear in the comment that we should still have certain metrics to be available is that they will still be overweighted just because of the ease with which we can use them, that we'll still have the same problem even if we say we're going to prioritize letters of recommendation over other things. I don't know that really solves the problem.
Salisha.
Sorry.
Go for it.
It just actually brings to a recent experience I had. So, I'm basically part of an inclusive pedagogy seminars in my college, and a lot of what is discussed here is, one of the things was, talking about, it was basically called as, social identity chart. I don't know if anybody has seen that. So basically what it is it asks you, what kind of group you are in, the privileged group. So if you say a certain category like socioeconomic class, and then the dominant group is upper class and wealthy and so on, and then if it's national origin, a US born is a dominant class, and then less privileged groups would be immigrants and such things. And then I was asked to take this as part of our inclusive pedagogy. And then well, maybe there were like 11 or 12 metrics, and probably I scored a 3 for being in the dominant group, maybe for education and so many things. And then I went and asked my coordinator, like, I mean, what does it mean? How bad would I feel just I'm scoring so poorly? I'm the less privileged in all of these. And is there a better way to measure that? And then then she brought up another survey about cultural capital,
Hmm.
just asking, are you living in a multi-generational household? And how have you had any examples of college educated people in your family and what their struggles are and those kinds of things. And in any kind of evaluation like that, there's really very rarely the strengths that some people see are not really even mentioned, and this paper really brings out all that. And I'm happy that was discussed. Thank you.
So I'd like to go ahead down the line here. This article, like I said, it talks in here about who's defining student success, and I think we've actually started to address that in our discussion here. But then we get into the recommendations. Again, recommendations for individual researchers, but I think we can think about this in terms of our own teaching guidelines, in terms of our own assessment strategies, to think about our own way of maybe reforming or refining how we define success to our own students. And what they tell us to do here is to self-reflect, which can be scary, but things that we have sort of already addressed in our conversation here about what it is that we may be doing, not out of malice, but just out of habit or tradition, that might not be most helpful or most supportive for all the students in your class. And so, again, this is an essay, not a research paper, so they're giving you recommendations. Recommendations can absolutely be debated, disagreed with, things like that. But just the idea of considering, just before you get into the nub of your work, what preconceived notions might exist that'll influence how you ultimately are going to do your assessment. And then if you're working with other people, agree upon a proper definition. And then alignment. It always comes back to alignment, right? So how am I doing my assessment? And is my assessment actually going to answer the questions that I truly want to ask, but maybe aren't asking very clearly or well, right? And so much of this ends up coming back to the choices that we make in terms of, are we doing a series of high stakes exams as the primary way a grade is done? Are we having more communication opportunities? Are we dividing the relative risk level of any particular assignment such that there's no, not that they're unimportant things, but that nothing is a deal breaker in terms of like, you need to do well on this or you're going to do bad in the whole course, right? So what are these ways we can do that allow a student to express sort of the ways in which they maybe have the most talent in being able to show their mastery of a given piece of material. And so what you see here is a particular model thinking about how to engage with students, how to engage with a group, to try to make sure that when you're planning on how to define success, define assessment strategies, things for your class, that you are actually thinking about all the students in your class and you're actually hearing all the voices, all the representation in your class. I'm certainly not a I mean, maybe it's a straightforward process, but it's certainly not an easy process to go through and maybe figure out how to do this successfully. Ronia, what do you feel?
So funny that, and the reason why I was so interested in today's session is because this is exactly what's been on my mind. And so this paper just kind of hit the nail right on the head. I gave exams before we adjourned for our break. And I had a lot of complaints about the exam because I teach chemistry. So it's very detail oriented. You see what I mean? And it's very algorithmic. So in the exams I give, and I love hearing student voices, but then I get a bunch of emails that say why the exam is tricky, right? And that it's asking for something in particular. And I argue, this is the process of science, right? It's not being tricky. The process of science is really looking at the details because the details really do matter. But I kind of reach a clash because here's me at the professional level seeing connections, and they're at the novice level and they're not seeing those connections that I am assessing on. So those points of argument for them is the exam does not align with what we've been taught, where I can go and look at a particular question in a particular model and say, here it is. Here's exactly where I taught you this. I just gave you a different version of that question on the exam, but they don't see it. So although I want to hear them out, sometimes I feel, and this paper does mention that, is you could hear student, doesn't mean that you have to necessarily change in regards, because you're the professional, you're the one who's been trained, and I'm really heavily involved, not just in chemistry, but in education research, right? So I know how to assess. So I kind of don't know what to do about that. So what is you guys' suggestion? How do you guys approach this when you feel this dilemma where you want to hear student voices, but you just don't think they are valid in some cases?
I don't really necessarily think there's anything wrong with some students not getting that connection yet. I think that's the difference between a basic level and an advanced level of understanding the content. I know they don't want to lose points for it, but if they have another chance to try it again or do test corrections or something like that, maybe they can get to that mastery level. And I think that there's nothing wrong with you assessing that way, because you're differentiating between a student that can regurgitate something that you gave them and apply something that you gave them.
I think one of the things that I've learned is that the students, sorry, I guess I had a moment. My brain didn't remember that thought. Sorry.
I was gonna say, I really like the idea of either retakes or giving the students the opportunity to take any kind of exam twice. The other thing I teach microbiology, which is biology and chemistry all combined. And so I get where you're coming from with the detail and the connections being important. And the other thing I typically do from a teaching perspective, when I have the opportunity to give them the same exam, well, it's not the same exam, but like Unit 3's exam, I have multiple versions of it, and they can do it twice. Every student can do it twice because the questions are in pools and all of the questions are aligned to learning objectives. So they may get a different version, but it's all attacking the same thing. But the one thing that the students really appreciated is using those high stakes, and they're all kind of medium stakes, but high stakes things, having the opportunity to do it twice, because that makes the assessment a learning opportunity. And I think that kind of reaches a larger group of people than just a one and done high stakes, you do well or you don't.
Thank you for that. Carly, you remembered what you were going to say?
Yes. So I just had a student share with me that same conversation last week where they're like, oh, on this test, this question was so tricky. And then afterwards they reread it when they realized they had gotten it wrong. It was like, oh, what I did was I didn't read this. I missed this word. And now that I'm reading it this way, I understand the question. I was like, you learned. Like, that's the goal and that's the point. And something that I think about when we tackle topics like this is how much is giving point values and grades for student learning actually doing harm when they're more concerned about getting the point for the question than going through that process of going, I learned something by making a mistake. And that's valuable because that's what learning is. Versus a student who got that answer correct and isn't going to think on it again and is probably going to lose that information because there's no lesson gained from it. So even students who are succeeding by getting that point are being harmed because they're not reflecting on that information learned. Which gets back to the whole problem with grades that you had brought up earlier. And it just feels like a cycle of how do you get away from students seeing value to the point? So how do we give points differently? Which is tough when you're within an institutionalized structure where there's rules to it and boards to it, and it's not completely your call to change things. And that's where I get frustrated, not knowing how to navigate that.
Selaja, you're muted.
So again, as much as I would like to see a change, in the reality of it is, it's still, we are still a very grade-driven society. I mean, grade-driven culture in the academics, right? So, I mean, that's one thing I always struggle with in labs, and I was going to ask the group about it. So, when I grade lab reports, it's pretty much, what they turn in, their data analysis and how well they can write or build an argument. But I also want ways to assess them while they're doing the lab. And there are so many students who are very intuitive, very observant in what they do in the lab and how well they work together as a team and being able to finish a task on time or follow instructions. But there is really, I don't know how people assess labs, and I always have struggled with that. Can I, set aside a portion of the grade for assessing those kinds of skills, and it'll serve them when they go to do research or, in their higher education, how people assess labs, and if there's a way to assess the other skills than just besides the lab report.
So Jara,
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I started to do, and this is not mentioned in here, but have you ever thought, guys, about self-evaluation and group evaluation? Because we do a lot of group work in workshops and in lab, Salaja, right? And I have my TAs give participation points, especially in the online virtual environment. So the students have to work in groups, and part of their grade is them unmuting their mic, collaborating, talking with each other. And the TA gives them a participation grade just by doing these behavioral observations. And it's not a huge part of their grade, but it comes out to be about, I think, 10% of their lab grade, which is really significant, in the long run. So that's how you encourage collaboration. The way that we do it, is to add to that layer. So, sorry, Holly, go ahead if you were going to say something about that.
I was going to say in lab, what I do is we have skills tests, and they can take them as many times as they want. And like one is using the pipetter. Like you picked the right one and you said it right and you pipetted the correct amount of liquid. And if they fail, they can take it again, but they can't go on to the next step until they show me that they've mastered the pipetter. And I'm a little privileged here because our classes are really small, so I can sit with each student and watch them do this as many times as they need to. The other thing that we do are drafts of the lab reports. So they get, basically freebie points for the drafts of the lab reports before they hand in the real high stakes lab report. And you kind of feel better about docking them for stuff in that last lab report, because it's like, I told you how to do this twice and you ignored me, and now you really do deserve to lose points for that. It's not like you didn't understand what you were supposed to do, you didn't implement my feedback. So then like they understand what they're supposed to do, they have set feedback, they improve, and then they have a high stakes lab report. And this feeds forward into their other classes too, and that it sucks when you have to reread these lab reports so many times, but doing that in one of the early classes really helps the quality of their lab reports in the later classes.
So ultimately, I scrolled down here to table 3 just to give you considerations they had on multiple levels here of risks or benefits of applying recommendation, risks of not applying recommendations. I mean, clearly the authors are looking at us to think about these ways to redefine the ideas of success. And that's reflected here in the way this stuff is presented. But I think it actually provides a nice conclusion to what the goal is of getting you to think about how it is that you're defining success. And actually some of the discussions we've had here today about the pros and cons of grades in general and about ways we figure out how our students are mastering things have been really interesting, right? And maybe certainly controversial for a lot of people. So I guess if we look at what's here, and we think about the overall message of the paper, what would you see as the maybe most accessible or the most logical next steps to sort of change attitudes? Not just your attitude, I mean, that's just you, but I mean the attitudes of a larger group, maybe the community as a whole, towards reconsidering some of these ideas.
One thing we're looking at is a portfolio assessment for all of our students, because it's a liberal arts college and we have a lot of things that we think are important for the students to do, but we really only assess the content in the major. And really all majors don't do that very well. So like, can they read and write? We didn't really assess that. We just assessed biology content. And like, what's the point of going to a liberal arts contest or liberal arts college if you don't get the liberal arts part of it? So I think you could sneak in a lot of these other assessments if you had kind of a rich portfolio that you were looking at, because you could see improvement over time and you could assess the individual and their actual reflections on things. So I think changing the tool that you use to assess could bring out more holistic data.
And I think Sue mentioned while she was here, doing the focus groups, but the trade-off being of the inconsiderable amount of time and energy necessary to extract that information. And so as you describe a holistic approach, I'm definitely on board with that. I'm also somewhat fearful of the amount of time it takes to generate that kind of data set and do it well. I guess that's the consideration, wanting to do it, but wanting to know how to efficiently do it. Christina.
I was surprised when I went to a small liberal arts college, and I assumed that I would have to see, like when you saw your counselor for each semester or each year, that that would be the kind of thing, the like portfolio review, kind of a CV review. That seems like that's where that should be built into, but it always seemed more of like a checklist. Like, do you have bring with me your list of classes you want to take next semester. You have all the correct prereqs, moving on. And I always felt fairly disappointed with the actual counseling and guidance in the college where I went, because it always just seemed like, yeah, I can look through prereqs. I did that. So that seems like the ideal space
you would need to support and like expand a counseling section of the college, but it seems like that's who really should be doing that so that it is holistic. But I
Yeah.
like the idea.
So support at a higher level, basically, something more institutional or institutional commitment to that kind of approach. Okay. Carly.
Something that I was talking about with a group I work with earlier this morning that hits on points that were just made too. Thinking about how we can assign work where the student has an option to complete it in different ways. So creating assignments where we clearly define the what, but they can approach the how in a way that resonates with them. And I am trying really hard to think very intentionally about how to go about doing that, because admittedly that means you have to then assess things in very different ways, and it's not as iterative for you, but that's really student-centered. Since your students are diverse, their assignment should be diverse too in order to reach them, and trying to push for assignments that we can design with really flexible hows. And that's something I'm working on that seems in line with this.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. I noticed the chat has been especially active here. Excellent. I'm noticing people are commenting about different ways to do lab notebooks as a skills test and ideas there. So if you have not looked at the chat in a little bit of detail, I encourage you guys to do that. Ronnie, I think you might have gotten the time zone wrong. If you're coming in just now.
Oh, what, did y'all already finish?
We've been going for an hour. We're about to wrap up. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I thought it was 10:30 Central.
Nope, 10:30 Eastern.
Okay.
But while you're here, we've been talking a lot about just these strategies for student success. I know I'm sort of catching you just immediate here, but can you give us your impressions of what you got out of this paper?
Yeah, I think the main points that I got out of this paper was really tailoring student success to what the needs of the students are and how they define success. Instead of how we as an academic institution, I know in my institution, we base academic success based on whether or not they're able to pass their NAPLEX scores or their, pharmacy, pretty much after they graduate, they take a pharmacy exam, and if they're able to pass that, then we say the students are successful. If they're not, then, that kind of dings us on our end of student failure. But truly, looking at some of the points that they brought up about how students feel about that, maybe taking into consideration leadership activities. I know, in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Houston, we have a lot of students who really are, excellent leaders and on both national and state levels. And so I think taking that into consideration on how we factor student success is very important. So I definitely resonate, I think it's going to be hard to kind of measure those outcomes. I think that's something they brought up, is some of the more broader definitions of student success and how we can actually measure that in clinical practice or in research in general. And so that's kind of like, I guess the next step is looking into how we can actually measure that.
And that's what we've been talking about. And I'm actually grateful for you bringing up the idea of leadership training as well. We're actually trying to do more deliberate efforts to consider how one can be a leader in STEM. We're actually working on an STEM proposal with the NSF to try to highlight that more for our own students, and we'll see how that goes. But that's another thing. So this has been a wonderful discussion, guys. Thank you for that. And Ronnie, we will have a recording available, so you can you can see
I
what we've been talking
appreciate it.
about. Yeah. And so again, all the ideas have been really cool here. Thank you guys for sharing. And so be on the lookout, both for those of you who are new, for the Foundational Journal Club, which Sue runs. And in a couple weeks, we'll have our April set. If anyone has a paper, by the way, that they would like to see highlighted and discussed in this journal club, please feel free to send it on to me. We're always happy to get your guys' inputs into this. All right, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.